when New York State was benefiting from some enormous unforeseen boom, a new technology, a driving force, it would diminish the impact. We acknowledge that. On the other hand, if New York State found itself in a repeat of the Great Recession and a profound slump, the effects would be dramatically worse. The evidence of that is we raised the minimum wage at the national level straight through the Great Recession. Previous law was getting phased in, and right now we have teenage unemployment in the United States that's approaching 20% still. We've priced them out of the labor market. That would happen in New York State if we were in a recession, God forbid. So what we did was just assume that the governor's forecast, the old Ways and Means Advisory Panel forecasts, which are really about the trend growth rates in New York State, will in fact play out exactly that way, and did it based on that.
What do you think about raising the minimum wage, not to some arbitrary number like 15, but based on some kind of index, like inflation or pricing? Does that make more sense?
Sharp changes have the most dramatic impact, and what your suggestion would do would be to have continuous minimal changes in the continuous smaller changes in the minimum wage.
There's been some proposals.
Yeah, there have been proposals of that type. So again, this goes back to what the gentleman asked. What happens if there are smaller increases? You get exactly that answer.
So that would be a better approach than picking a number.
I'm not going to characterize it as better or worse. For me, I'm not a fan of any policy that is not pro-work. In the end, the dividing line between poverty and non-poverty is work. And if we're having proposals which are inhibiting the ability of Americans to work, I think we should try other proposals.
Was there any information in your study in regards to age of the workers receiving the wage? Like if workers, I'm saying, under 21 didn't receive that increase of $15, did it have a different effect on the economy?
We know the characteristics of the workers in the national data. It's admittedly a harder thing to get data on the demographics of the New York State labor forces to the degree we would have liked. But the caricature that it's only teenagers who are making the minimum wage or something, that just isn't true. And we can provide you the data. We didn't analyze differential minimum wage policies. There was a time when we had a, quote, training wage for teenagers and for new hires, and that differential provided an incentive to get people into jobs, but that's been gone for years.
Do you think that they should eliminate the minimum wage?
I'm not here to advocate eliminating it. It's in place. The labor market's adjusted to it. So you wouldn't want to.
You're arguing essentially that the higher the wages, the fewer jobs there are. So why not eliminate the minimum wage? That way would more people be hired?
It's not literally always going to be true. It's a matter of the economics. If the market wage is going to be $9 and you have a minimum wage of $5, the minimum wage is irrelevant, and so there's no reason to eliminate it, no reason to raise it. So that depends on market conditions, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to find out across the regions.
What about the argument Governor Cuomo and supporters have made? Yeah, they're working at whatever it is now, $8, $9 an hour, but the state and taxpayers have to subsidize them with food stamps and housing subsidies. So really, it's the taxpayers who are paying for these people, even though they're working.
So I encourage the governor to get me rehired at Syracuse and come take an economics class. If you provide a standard of living outside the workplace, the only way to get someone to leave that standard of living and go to the workplace is pay them more, not less. And so the argument's exactly wrong and backwards.
Can you explain that again?
So if I've got as I'm sure I do, I have my children supporting me, hanging out at home. They give me $150,000 a year. What's going to get me to go to work? It's going to have to be more than that. So you're forcing a firm to compete with the outside support you're getting. That raises wages. It doesn't lower it.
But in New York City, I think they've shown that a lot of people in the fast food industry are getting public assistance.
But that doesn't mean that they're getting less money on their job because of the existence of the public assistance.
But their business model seems to be to keep wages down and transfer some of the compensation to the public.
Everybody's business model is to keep their wages down as much as they can, but they have to hire workers in the end. They need them, their skills, their contribution to the growth of the firm, the ideas they bring, and they have to pay them to do it. The question is how much, and other options, whether it's a competitor firm or starting up their own business or public assistance, raise the wage they have to pay to attract them and retain them.
Is there a point, or is there any minimum wage increase that would be less damaging to the economy, to an incremental step?
Yes, no, I mean, there will be less damaging ones. So again, just be clear on the nature of the argument. There will be people who benefit. They will have a job, keep a job, get a raise, and that's ultimately the driving interest of those people. The labor market has been quite bad, and the distress is very real. But there will be those who will not get hired, who would otherwise have been hired. They will be damaged. The smaller the increase, the less of that will go on.
Do you have a figure like where it breaks one way or the other, or it goes out like a critical mass of that?
We don't have such a figure, and it's a hard one to decide because in the end, you're weighing the welfare of a person who doesn't get a job versus the welfare of someone who gets a raise. How you pick between those is going to be a matter of your values and your judgments.
Also, if I could point out, it's a big diverse state, so I think the sweet spot question is misplaced, but the other point is, I think the sweet spot question is misplaced. It is, after all, a big state with a great deal of variety and diversity in the level of what the market wage is. So it's impossible to stand here in Albany and say, well, actually, the sweet spot is 1050, you know? Well, 1050 where? I mean, that's so, I think, and a lot of this debate, frankly, has been driven also by the politics of New York City, which is not a justification for a $15 minimum wage in New York City either, but it's also worth observing that New York City is hyper expensive and a different kind of labor market than Syracuse or Buffalo or Binghamton.
The governor has offered tax cuts, or at least put that on the table. Is there any way that those kind of incentives offset the damage that you're talking about today?
I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with exactly the nature of those offsetting.
I don't think he is either, but.
Then I'll express skepticism that they're targeted to offset the damage. I mean, the reality is we do have one example at the federal level of a tax policy that is pro-work and which is targeted very effectively on poverty, and that's the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so for those who are interested in helping low-income workers, you know, a natural place to go is to put the minimum wage debate aside and go to something that has a track record of success and which is targeted much more effectively. There's a pilot in New York City, for example, that's looking at doubling up the Earned Income Tax Credit for single people who are not custodial parents, where the EITC is about $400. It's not very generous. That strikes me as worth exploring as opposed to these kinds of policies.
I'd like to come back to those most at risk for job losses. Like, do you have a breakdown as far as what fields may be most at risk? Retail, manufacturing. Who's most at risk for losing their jobs under a $15 minimum wage?
So we don't have it in the paper, but I'd be happy to go back and get you something. You know, the traditional profile is very simple. It's someone with a high school degree or less working in retail fast food. That's the profile. For this proposal, as EJ has pointed out, the upstate labor markets are very different than the downstate one, and so it creeps up much higher into the wage distribution, and it's going to hit more industries, it's going to hit more people with bigger skills than the traditional story, and that's the part we could do our best to document for you.
As you probably already know, New York is currently undergoing a phased-in increase in the minimum wage. Do you know how that would compare to this chart and what you found, raising it to 15?
You mean the current law putting it to 9?
It's going up like, what, 50 cents a year or something like that?
But that ends at the end of this year. It goes to 9 at the end of this year.
And are there any data on how that affected the job loss or anything?
I don't have particulars from New York State on that, but as I mentioned in the opening, there have been an enormous number of ballot initiatives, municipal initiatives to raise minimum wages across the country. That provides a sort of natural place to go look and see if you can find negative impacts. And the thing that we have found already in sort of the easiest places to look, large municipalities that on their own raise their minimum wages sharply, you look in the restaurant industry, you get much slower employment growth. And I emphasize that because this caricature of everyone just getting tossed out of their job isn't right. What you do is inhibit the progress of the economy. That progress is under 1% in those municipalities. It's over 2.5% outside those municipalities in the same states. So, you know, that's an early read on the success of some of these efforts.
Just going back to the sweet spot discussion, the political reality, at least traditionally here, has been that we end up with some kind of a compromise here. Is there really no compromise that you see here, something under 15 that would be effective and not hurtful for a
a lot of people?
I'll just express my ignorance of the politics and how it's going to work out. EJ may want to comment. I don't know.
I would only observe that if, it depends on what the goal is. If the goal is, we've got to do something to help poor workers, they're still not doing well enough. We have to help people who are working but near the poverty line. In fact, the governor's frequent quote is, nobody who works full-time should live in poverty. Now, the partial answer to that is thanks to their earned income credit, which in New York is one of the most generous in the country, matching the federal, and other cash benefits. Strictly speaking, not that people are like, well off, nobody who works full-time has to live in poverty if they qualify for the bigger earned income credit. So the question is, if the question is, do we need to do more for the low-income workers, low-wage workers who are struggling to get by in a low-wage job, the answer is not some sweet spot in a blanket minimum wage. It's revisiting the earned income credit, figuring out how we can deliver it better to the right people. That's a targeted benefit. In fact, the irony in the governor suggesting he would do a business tax cut to try to somehow offset this. Well, the earned income credit is a tax benefit that is actually targeted directly to low-income workers. So if you want to do a tax, you could actually kill two birds with one stone and actually help the poorest workers by revisiting the earned income credit, not by giving some blanket tax cut to a lot of businesses, which is another way of simply poorly targeting money and, sort of in the interest of making some political deal around it.
So if that's true, why do you think they're going for the minimum wage? Is it just easier?
Well, look, one thing quickly here. We're talking about the substance of this. All of the coverage of this has been, why are they doing this? Who's going to win? Who's going to take what position? Where's the compromise going to be? Who? Well, I don't know. I can't inquire into their
I'm
motives.
just saying, is it easier to sell minimum wage than a more complicated?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, it's a simpler concept. People who are not near the earned income credit don't know that it exists, probably. But people who are getting it know very well that it exists. It's thousands of dollars. A single parent of one person, living in New York State and working, they're getting over $4,000 from the earned income credit. That's a pretty significant amount.
For decades, economists have studied the minimum wage. For decades, people like me have said, this is how this actually works as opposed to how it's advertised. You, the public, buyer beware. Your intentions are good. The outcomes may not match that. And consistently, in ballot initiative after ballot initiative, the average person votes for a minimum wage increase. So it's popular, I assure you.
Get benefits like 401k or health insurance, and did you take that into account?
We don't know their benefit packages, and so there's no particular accommodation for that in the study.
So do you see any positive of raising the minimum wage, or is it just a negative situation with this raise?
I believe the right way to think about it is exactly the way EJ framed it, which is there's a problem. The problem is Americans who are working and we're not satisfied with the quality of the standard of living that they have. Let's find policies that enhance that standard of living while improving the work that's possible for them to get. And the minimum wage isn't in that category of policies. The earned income tax credit is.
Positive outcome for raising the minimum wage in New York?
There's always a positive outcome if you've got a job and you don't lose your job or you get hired despite the increase, you'll make more money. So in these proposals, there will always be the judgment that the policymakers have to make and voters make about their policymakers, because nothing's unambiguous. These are the.
The only positive you see would be for the people who are employed. Everybody else is going to be negative for all the other workers.
Yeah, it's going to be a cost for businesses, and that means higher prices for everybody. It's going to be workers that don't get hired, and that's a loss for them. And the only people who benefit are those who manage to get hired or keep their job at a wage that's bigger than it would have been.
But not to be pedantic here, but isn't that what Cuomo's arguing? This is to benefit the people who are working at minimum wage jobs, not necessarily aimed at people who are buying hamburgers or other things.
I'm not familiar with the governor's rhetoric on this. All I'm saying is, if you want to make that argument, you could target much more carefully the benefit, because a lot of this is going to go to people who are not particularly poor, right? It will go to the affluent teenagers who have summer jobs at $30,000 a year. So there's a targeting issue, and then there's what I view as a fundamental failure to recognize the price impacts, which don't help on a poverty program, and the fact that some people who don't get jobs are effectively being asked to give up their income to people who have jobs, and that seems like a sort of perverse way to go at solving what is a genuine problem.
I would also observe, if I could, because based on what the governor has said, the governor and other advocates have basically, and this is part of the issue with the substance not being discussed, they portrayed this as complete win-win. Hey, we have an idea. Raise the minimum wage, and then people will have more money, and everything will be better. And what has not been acknowledged or even noticed is the issue of, well, will it affect the number of people who are employed getting the higher wage? Right. That's the whole point of what we're doing. So like you were saying that he said, well, no, our point is we want to get it to poorer workers who work in the minimum wage. The whole point of this discussion is those people will not have employment opportunities going forward in fairly large numbers. And that if those are the people you want to help, you're actually hurting a lot of them. Right. In the present, but also in the future, as more and more people come along. And again, it's people with just high school degrees or maybe just a GED. It's people in marginal populations of all sorts who are trying to get onto their first job, get employed. They're the people who will be hurt by this. And I don't think, by any stretch of your imagination, the governor intends that to happen. And the problem is that the advocates of this policy pretend or just like fail to notice or even acknowledge not just the possibility, the probability that that will happen, that there will be a trade-off. And there's quite a few economists left of center who've supported higher minimum wages nationally at a more moderate level who've actually acknowledged that much, who are worried about a $15 minimum wage and its possible impact on those populations. So this is not some sort of, radical idea. This is pretty mainstream.
Did your report look at the damage or the impact this would have on the state's overall climate for doing business and the ability to attract new businesses into the state?
The answer is no. It assumed that the New York State economy in the aggregate continues on the sort of baseline forecast. No recession, no boom, and no exodus to other states.
Do you have any sense of what it would do, though, the ability to bring in new jobs, to bring in new companies, make the state more attractive?
Qualitatively, it makes other things being the same, right? I mean, I know there are other policy proposals on the table, but other things being the same, it makes it a less attractive place to start or to expand businesses.
Okay? We probably have to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much. There we go.